Sitting in an open street shopping mall in Alice Springs waiting for a bus to Brisbane, because, fuck yay, when an elderly Aboriginal man approached me. I removed my headphones and heard him ask me, "You got a smoke brew?" I flashed a quick smile and offered him a couple from my open packet, and he grabbed two. He smiled back at me, said thank you and turned to walk away. I put my headphones back in and went back to reading a magazine when I saw all this commotion around the mall. I stood up to see what's going on, and there's old mate, face down on the concrete. Apparently he just dropped dead. Didn't even light the cigarette. I felt kinda weird while I sat there with his people, but they were cool as shit and didn't give me a hard time. He used to work as a psychiatric care tech for a state mental hospital. We were extremely limited in the amount of care we could provide to profoundly physically ill patients, so we would occasionally get assigned to a patient who was at an actual local hospital. This was called a hospital vigil, and our only task was to ensure the patient's safety, since they were technically the state's responsibility. So we didn't provide any care, except talking with the patient, communicating with the nurses, and just making sure nothing hinky was going on. My third year, I was assigned a patient whose diagnosis was a personality disordered couple with extreme anorexia. She was approximately 50 and her body was absolutely destroyed by a lifetime of losing the fight against her eating disorder. Toward the end, her digestive system was so fucked they were pumping feces out of her stomach. She was also attached to a bunch of other machines, including a ventilator. She was not leaving the hospital alive. Her adult children were no longer in contact with her, and her husband had divorced her many years prior. She had no visitors. She eventually lost the ability to speak, especially with all the breathing machines, so we worked out a series of hand gestures to help with communication. Holding up one finger meant whiteboard, which she would use to write out more complicated requests. Holding up two fingers meant she was in some sort of respiratory distress, which meant we needed to alert the nurse. Holding up three fingers meant I'm afraid, or having an anxiety or panic attack. She rarely used three fingers. We had grown quite close since I was assigned vigil duty 5 or 6 nights out of a 6-day work week. This is probably because I never complained about it. There are very strict rules when it comes to what my employer considered fraternization. However, I believe that every patient deserved to be treated like a human being. I have had my share of troubles, and had a there but by the grace of God go type attitude. We played cards, we chatted, and we may have even played a few games of hangman/tic-tac-toe on her whiteboard. After 2 or so months, her body finally shut down. I was there when she died. She showed me 3 fingers, which meant she was scared, so I just held her hand and gave it a soft squeeze. I told her she wasn't alone, so she didn't need to be afraid. And she just kinda slipped away. The hand I wasn't holding still had 3 fingers up. Several nurses and a doctor were soon surrounding her body, and they dismissed me. I called my supervisor, to make sure I followed protocol. And that was it. Later that week, I got a written warning for holding the hand of a terrified dying woman. A nurse reported me for unprofessional behavior, indirectly, as a kid. Paragliding accident. I watched the guy take off a mountain slope, and eventually fly over a river, getting lower and lower. He rounded the bend of a mountain, out of sight, and I quizzically thought that he must have landed in the river. Turns out he did, and they didn't get him out in time. His paraglider got caught on some branches and he was stuck in the river. The mountain river was too cold, and too violent, with fast-moving water and rocks. I'm not sure what killed him first. Apparently, he hadn't paraglided there before, and I'm told it's common to experience a drop right over bodies of water when you paraglide. Poor guy. Yeah, this happened at the end of January. My younger brother died of cancer while I was with him. He had a lot of problems including substance abuse, so it wasn't really all that surprising that he would die first. I had been sensing that it would come for a few years, so that when we heard the diagnosis I was sad but not surprised. I live out of state, so I could not visit him often. I made sure to on his birthday, and returned a few days afterward. At that time he was actively dying. His skin was cold and he was agitated. He looked at me very closely, though, so I know he knew I was there. He was moaning with every breath. I prayed silently for God to relieve his pain, and immediately he quieted and began what I now know to be agonal breathing and then nothing. I'm glad I was with him. I'm his big sister and he always looked to me to take care of him. Wasn't there when my dad passed overnight, but we took turns keeping vigil in his last week. It was awful seeing him decline. The cancer had spread to his brain and he had meningitis. Basically he couldn't even speak to us anymore, he was just in so much pain. He'd often convulse and groan. But sometimes he'd squeeze my hand. The night before he passed we were planning on taking him home for hospice. I remember crying when we made the decision to not resuscitate him. I remember whispering in his ear, "I love you. Don't be afraid. I will take care of the family, you have nothing to worry about." I wanted him to go peacefully and without worrying. Everyone, his doctors and my family, thought he'd have maybe another several days left or even a week or two. I even asked my husband for his professional opinion and he said probably a week. But I had a strange feeling it'd be sooner rather than later. The next morning at 6 a.m. I got the call that he had passed. He chose a moment in the 6 hours that my mom and I weren't there. We had taken turns for a whole week and that night my uncle was the one keeping vigil. I just had a feeling that was because my daddy didn't want us to see him go, that it would be too painful. My uncle said it was very peaceful, he just stopped breathing. You sometimes hear a last breath but that's just the rest of the gas escaping. I rushed to the hospital, over an hour away from my home, and my family who had gotten there earlier had spent the entire time holding and rubbing his hand to keep it warm for me. I got to hold his hand one last time. My grandpa was holding his mouth together but my dad looked like he was smiling, like he was having a nice dream and didn't have a care in the world. I hadn't seen that in a long time. Ever since he became sick his resting face was always a wince from the pain that not even morphine could take away. I watched my cousin's dog get hit by a car when I was 7 or 8. My cousin, 6 or 7, and I were biking up their long dirt driveway to the dirt road that continued past their house and the dog was following us. We stopped at the intersection and the dog was walking at the edge of the road. We beckoned for him to come back onto the driveway when a blue vehicle, probably a late 90s or early 2000s Suburban, sped past, probably going over the speed limit, and launched the dog into the air. I presume he was hit on the head and shoulders. He landed with a solid thud on the ground in front of us, shaking, but otherwise not moving. We didn't know what to do, and we were desperately thinking about how we might possibly be able to save him when he stopped shaking. His tongue, which had been sticking out slightly since he landed, had turned gray. My cousin, with tears in her eyes, yelled, "Go get my mom." So I grabbed my bike and biked as fast as I possibly could back to the house, where I started screaming, "Auntie! Auntie! Vegas, the dog, got hit by a car." Through tears. At this point everyone who was home was crying. We called my uncle and told him what happened since he was at work at the time. When he got home he gently picked up Vegas and brought him to the corner of a tree line and some grass fields. He buried him, gathered us, and we had a funeral for him. My dad heard about this event and bought a small chunk of rock from a custom masonry company and had Vegas forever in our hearts engraved on it and placed it when he came to pick me up. Forgive me for the long story, but this is the first time been able to tell it in 15 years. My mom. She had COPD. She was in intensive care. They kept trying to get her to take a breathing device that would basically force air down your throat and be sucked to your face. She kicked and punched the doctors away. She knew she was dying and had been in pain for a really long time. The worst was when I took my hand out from hers for a second. And I mean a second. Her hand was indented from where mine was. It was like her hand was casting around mine. This point there were no machines and she was pretty close to being gone, obviously. Her hand was only warm cause I was holding it. I was 27. It messes me up sometimes, but holy hell, I wouldn't have ever not been beside that woman as she passed. My dad passed in hospital when I was 24 and that really sucked. I wasn't there. She would have literally killed for us, and she was an amazing woman. I'm happy out of all the moms she was mine. Another not so great one, best friend's dad's suicide. Hanging from the clothing pole in a closet. What always sticks with me is if he really wanted to he could have stood up. Like he hung himself almost on his knees. Her boyfriend had to cut him down. We were 19. I was the only person to speak at his funeral, as requested by my best friend. I'm glad I got to do that. But I was there when he passed as well. My mom and him were pretty close friends. I miss them all. I was 4 years old. The memory is hazy and almost a dream. But from what I can recall, my mom was washing dishes and got a call from my aunt, who told her that my granddad was having a heart attack. Since we lived on the same block as him, she picked me up and ran with me to their house after 911 was called. What I remember is chaos. Watching him wheeze and struggle for breath, my mom trying to get me to play in the other room with the dog so I wouldn't see it, but coming out anyway. My mom was really panicked and was trying to keep Granddad awake while being on the phone with 911. I watched him take his last breath. It is an impression that will stay with me forever. The death rattle is real. Soon, the paramedics came and took him away, but he was already dead. This is pretty much my first memory. I try to think that it's not a huge part of my life, but it pops up here and there. Sadly, he's not the first person I've seen dead. I like to believe that this early introduction to death and dying has been a gift. I feel like I understand how close we all are to dying at any moment. I think my calling might be to help people transition. I've wanted to get into the death industry in a humane way for some time, but I don't know how to start. In high school, a classmate got hit by a car in front of the school. A buddy and I were waiting for the crosswalk light when a guy we both knew, but weren't really friends with, ran by us, crossing against the light, and was hit by a car trying to beat the yellow. He was wearing a Sony Walkman. Personal music devices were very new, that may have contributed to not noticing the speeding car. I heard a sickening crunch and looked over to see his body pinwheeling through the air and landing in a heap. The car kept going. I ran towards him. My buddy ran back to the school to call 911. Cell phones were still 10 years away. When I got to him, I sorta cradled his head in my arms, embracing him protectively, but he was obviously extremely fucked up all over. He had landed head/face first from probably 15 in the air, and a big piece of skull/scalp/hair was flopped open like a trapdoor, exposing his brain. I kept trying to hold the trapdoor shut, but it was slippery with blood. I remember he had the bluest eyes I had ever seen on anyone, and he was looking right at me with a shocked and confused look on his face. He stared at me for about 30 seconds and then the life just seeped slowly out of him. No drama, no gasping for air, no calling for his mama, he just stopped being alive. It was like someone was slowly turning down a dimmer switch as his eyes went from piercing blue to light blue to dull gray blue. I think he bled out. It was the first dead person I had ever seen, and it struck me that when we are alive, we have limitless potential. When we are dead, we are nothing, a bag of meat. The ambulance guys showed up and took him away. They didn't even try CPR, they knew he was past resuscitation. When they picked him up to put him on the gurney, most of the back of his head fell off, his skull was shattered. After they left, I noticed the kid's sneakers were still on the road in the crosswalk in the exact position he had been in when he had been hit. The car had knocked the kid right out of his shoes. They weren't even tipped over. That was the 80s, so there was no counseling or PTSD considerations, and it never really affected me, didn't think or talk much about it. Then about 10 years later, I was watching an episode of Star Trek, TNG with my GF, and there was a scene where LaForge opens a trapdoor on Data's head and folds back the hair, and I came unglued. A friend were on the bus and he started talking about a website with these freaky videos, and you had to try and not get grossed out or scared or give up for as long as you can. We were on the 5th video, and when it starts, it's filmed by a camera in the top corner of the room, pointed at a bathtub. It was of an escape artist who has tied herself up with her legs above her hands behind her legs, and her head underwater. She finishes tying a knot, and begins trying to slip out of the ropes. She moves around like she's trying to attempt something she saw in a video. The ropes don't budge. She tries grabbing the knots near her hands, but the ropes are too tight for her to reach. Her movements get more and more erratic to the point where it seems like her thrashing might hurt her. After about a minute, she suddenly just stops. Me and my friend look at each other with surprise on both our faces. I was the first to say anything. I literally just said, "Holy fuck." I have been with 3 family members during their last moments: my wife's grandmother, my own grandmother, and my dad. They were all under hospice care. It was a lot of waiting, talking with other family, watching the hospice nurses come in and out. The final moments always come suddenly. There's a horrible rattle as they breathe. It's literally called a death rattle. There are YouTube videos that show examples. Then, finally, they take 1 or 2 large gasps of breath and it's over. This is my experience when it comes to hospice care. I can't speak for everybody else's experience. My wife was with her mom at a hospital under palliative care. She seemed to struggle at the end even though she was sedated. In my experience, if you get the chance to be with a loved one in their final moments, always take the opportunity. You'll find yourself thinking about them, finding closure, even saying things you always wanted to say to them. You may even bring them comfort. Of course, your mileage may vary. But, bottom line, don't be afraid. Unfortunately, I have witnessed 3 family members die in their palliative state. Both parents had aggressive types of cancer, and grandmother died from an outbreak of C. diff, superbug, infection. Each one was unique with some common acts, like seeing the body slowly stop working and the chain reaction. Some die fast and others extremely slow. What no one tells you is how you can see the emotion states one goes through, even though one isn't alert or aware, and also, how those in this state of dying can hear everything. The science behind it all is amazing when you can get past the true sadness of losing your loved one. I love to share more on how each one was different if it helps anyone wanting to know. Yes, there were some amazing spiritual examples of how our mind is so powerful and is obviously the last part to go. What is most important is that people shouldn't die alone, they know you are with them. So those dying alone from coronavirus is a very lonely, sad and scary vision.